Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening, and welcome to our Coexistence in Practice webinar series hosted by the Coexistence Consortium. Before we start today's talk, I'd like to give you a brief intro about us and the structure of this webinar. We are a network of conservation researchers and practitioners from diverse disciplines united by a common vision to understand the intricate dynamics of coexistence between humans and wildlife. Our mission extends beyond the conservation of wild animals confined to distant forest pockets. We emphasize the importance of living well with nature, even in our immediate surroundings. Our collective long-term vision is to employ an experimental and evidence-based approach to catalyze a variety of context-specific human-wildlife coexistence projects worldwide. Just a bit about the structure of this webinar. Our speaker, Paul, will be presenting for around 40 to 45 minutes, which will be followed by a short Q&A for 15 to 20 minutes. I now request Tarsh, who is a member of the consortium, to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thanks, Varun, and welcome everyone. I'm going to slightly deviate from a very formal introduction and tell you a little bit about how Paul and I first met. It was one of these conferences, SCB, I think, in Bangalore, where we had hundreds of parallel sessions going on, full of quantified kind of data and rigorous models on understanding various things, including the human-animal relationship. And a group of us found ourselves kind of isolated in the evening, really frustrated by everything about how we couldn't understand the world entirely in very positivist terms. You can't structure and kind of quantify everything, but what are ways in which different people and different forms of knowledge can meaningfully engage with biology and ethology and all of this and come together. And that's when we kind of hit it off really well. And I remember kind of saying, I think I'm done with doing any more of this kind of modeling and structured positivist work. And Paul was totally on board with that. And we became good friends since then. Um, he also co-published a book and organized a conference called Composing Worlds with Elephants. That was incredible. It brought together so many different people with so many diverse perspectives who wouldn't otherwise talk to each other, from the very positivist ethologists who did almost experimental behavioral work with elephants to ethnographers and historians and everything. And it was a very interesting model for the conference as well. It was kind of hybrid with a website and everybody's talks uploaded. So it was really fascinating. And more than anything, he talked to Shubhra about the Lantana elephants. And I think to date, that's one of the deepest and most insightful pieces that anyone has ever written about the Lantana elephants and everything we're trying to achieve. So it's been incredible knowing Paul. But a little more of a kind of formal introduction. Paul is a multi-species anthropologist and human-animal ethnographer who completed his PhD in 2016 on people's relationship with working and wild elephants in Assam. He published a book from this, very interestingly titled The Presence of Elephants, Sharing Lives and Landscapes in Assam. And then he co-authored the book coming out of that Composing Worlds conference I mentioned, which is also a fascinating piece of work, which spans multiple disciplines, but all kind of centered around elephants. His work explores the practical, embodied, and mundane ways in which humans and elephants shape each other's lives and how they share minds, identities, tasks, and landscapes through coexistence. He currently lives in Prague, the Czech Republic, and is based at the Institute of Ethology at the Czech Academy of Sciences. And he's a bit of an imposter there, I think, going by the general profile of the institute, because he does very ethnographic work. For the last 5 years, he's been researching the aesthetics and interspecies dynamics of pig hunting in Australia, as well as analyzing shifting perspectives on the place and identity of feral pigs in Australia. He'll be leaving this position at the end of the year and is developing another ethnographic project which explores the experiences and practices that kill in the name of biosecurity and considers the role of death in maintaining environmental imaginaries. And more than all of this, of course, he's a really nice guy, and I feel quite privileged to have him as a friend. And I kind of hope everybody can get to know him better. And he continues with some shape or form of work in India. Thanks, Paul. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Tash. I'm both touched and honoured, really, and especially that I've been invited to share my thoughts on some of my work that I did. So I'm just going to share my screen now, everyone. So just bear with me for a moment. Yep, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you everyone for your patience. And okay, so yeah, so I think Tash gave a fairly, good introduction overview of my work. And yeah, it's been some time since I finished my PhD, and life led me astray, and I finally found the chance to kind of publish my work, from my thesis, and that's what I'll be referring to here, like referring to the kind of book that came out late last year called The Presence of Elephants. And so yeah, basically, it's a book that looks at different facets of human-elephant relationships beyond conflict, I guess. Yeah, I'm not really kind of a coexistence researcher, but I am interested in, how, like the book says, like how humans and elephants share lives and landscapes. And I think that has a close overlap, and it really speaks to broadly what coexistence is. I will refer through coexistence throughout this talk, but if I, make poor generalizations or simplifications, please don't, hold it against me. I am a trained anthropologist, and so yeah, I think that means that my kind of interest and subject of analysis is more geared towards people. Like I'm really quite often interested in people who are interested in animals and how animals affect those people, and in turn how people also affect animals. And it doesn't mean I don't take animals seriously as agents or subjects in my unit of analysis. It just means they probably feature less prominently. But yeah, so just to give you just a quick, I won't talk about my book too much, but just to give you a brief, quick overview of the kind of my book. I did research in the kind of forest fringe areas just outside of the capital city of Assam, Guwahati, and there's a kind of isolated forest landscape with about maybe approximately 115 free roaming elephants. And, they used to kind of like cross paths with people in all shape or form. And so I was kind of interested in exploring those different kind of shapes or forms by which people kind of interacted and, encountered elephants. And so there was kind of three broad analytical themes that I think the book kind of touched upon. And I think so firstly, there was this, for me, like living with wildlife was about the, exploring the tensions, unevenness, and asymmetries of sharing, right? Like it's exploring those kind of, for me, it's kind of like always exploring how things are, the dynamic relationship between of how human and elephant lives overlap. And that an account of coexistence always needs to be kind of aware of the kind of balance of contradictory ideas that, coexistence requires, right? It's always about like balancing between proximity and distance, and compassion and opposition, animality, divinity, self and other, familiarity and incomprehension, the domestic and wild. I mean, there's always these kind of balance of contradictory ideas. And I think that was the first key point of the book. The second key point of the book, or key theme, was like co-presence. I kind of refer the word co-presence to coexistence, and it's not because coexistence is a bad term. I think it's actually a great term that's gathered together so many people from different disciplines, and it's opened the new vistas on how to imagine human-wildlife relationships beyond the narrow confines of the term conflict. But it also is a bit too general for me, right? And, as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, I'm really into the kind of practical, everyday lived relations. I'm into the embodied relations, the intersubjectivity between humans and elephants, also like the reciprocal relations, the back and forth exchanges, and also how they're done in particular places and contexts. And I felt that this term co-presence, helped point me more accurately or specifically towards that kind of lived experience of coexistence. And the third theme that my book touches upon and I want to talk about today is this idea of vulnerability, right? And I want to talk about it because I think, as I was reading the book, it seemed to me it was a concept, an experience that was so present throughout all the chapters, but I really didn't start kind of like articulating or formulating it towards the end of the book when I was writing the conclusion in mid-2023. And so I think, in some ways, I'm really kind of looking forward to like sharing like my thoughts on vulnerability, which I still feel is somewhat uncooked and undeveloped, and wondering if, like, especially among all these people here who have, far better coexistence minds than me, and maybe seeing if it resonates in any way or it has any kind of value, or it could be, transferred to other kind of wildlife situations. So, so just basically, structured into this, so this this talk structured into 3 parts is like, what do I mean by vulnerability? The methodological role of vulnerability, and how vulnerability informs the concept of coexistence. So yeah, I'll start moving on. Okay, so part 1, what do I mean by vulnerability? So it's obviously vulnerability is not something new, right, to coexistence research, right? It's like, you know, clearly it's everywhere. Like, coexistence research is driven by the idea that, like, wildlife, and I guess Asian elephants in this instance, are an endangered species. Their ways of life are being deeply undermined by expanding infrastructure and industry. And of course, the human dimension, the people who are most affected by elephants are usually people who live on the margins of society, you know, geographically and socioeconomically. And I think both humans and elephants, you know, are also subjects who are, these subjects I just mentioned, they're also subjects who are quite vulnerable to history and the kind of worlds that have been set in motion under colonialism, right? But I think if let's talk about vulnerability a bit more, and I think I want to distinguish 2 different ways we could conceive vulnerability. So the first way is the concept that looks at, you know, vulnerability where it's talking about groups that are more vulnerable than others, right? And I think this kind of reflects the kind of human and elephant subjects of coexistent research that I just mentioned a few moments ago. And so vulnerability here is used to reference those particularly disenfranchised people, people cast as victims sometimes, or possessing a diminished agency in society. And quite often, and I think particularly in Western society, I think, you know, vulnerability is often cast as a kind of weakness to be, you know, overcome. But it's the second concept of vulnerability that I want to focus on here today, and it's this. It's also about agency, like a lack of agency, but it attempts to capture how lack of agency is present in a much broader sense, in, you know, ontologically speaking, or just in everyday existence, right? So I think now it might get a bit with some jargon, but vulnerability is about like a kind of unpower or a lack of power that is at the core of all our lives, right? It's about, following Gilson, I define vulnerability as, you know, being as an openness to being affected, but also affecting the world in ways that, you know, a person cannot control. It's about being susceptible to things we don't know, like things we can't comprehend, and things we cannot predict, right? It's this in our relationships with the world, it's an always like kind of ever-present limitation to the power, limitation of our power over ourselves and also other people and other animals in this instance, right? And so vulnerability is like a condition of human existence and being in relationship with others. Vulnerability here is not, you know, necessarily a negative or positive or a desirable or undesirable thing. It's just a thing that is. And I think, you know, human elephant literature, which still I think is a bit biased towards conflict stuff, you know, does often look at how people are vulnerable to elephants, for example. But it's usually done by focusing on these kind of negative aspects, like the kind of anxiety, the disruption, the injury, the damage, and the death. These are sometimes it frames being vulnerable to elephants as part of the costs of living. But I kind of think we need to kind of look past this idea of like the cost of living, right? And, you know, obviously myself, but also multi-species researchers and coexistence research all share this kind of sentiment, right? And we're kind of interested in looking at vulnerability as, you know, more than conflict and negative risk, and how if we look at vulnerability, it can represent a complex and diverse set of experiences that can be detrimental, valuable, or otherwise. And I feel that if we're attuned to this broader concept of vulnerability beyond negative manifestation, then we can be attuned to a broader spectrum of ways in which human and elephants shape each other's lives. And in doing so, better map out the nuances of coexistence and how it is done on the day-to-day basis. Just before we move on, I just want to say these 2 concepts of vulnerability that are brought up, we can't necessarily disentangle them. We can't do a neutral reading of vulnerability, a broad reading, without making reference to the specific political, historical, and ecological injustices. So yeah, but just keep that in mind, and I'll loop back to that point later on in the talk. And don't worry if it's not entirely clear what I mean by vulnerability. If we jumping from like this movement away from positivism, so then vulnerability can represent something that's a very kind of vague kind of experience or very difficult to articulate, right? So, but I think it will become a bit more clear as I move on through the talk. Okay, so part 2, vulnerability and method. And so how can vulnerability inform methods and approaches to studying shared human and wildlife landscapes and worlds? I think that I'm going to start off by talking about agency here, because I think conceptualizing non-human animal agency has been an important method and strategy for coexistence research and multi-species research. And how does the concept of vulnerability help researchers attune to the agency of non-humans in a shared world? I want to ask, and whereby agency, I just simply mean who animals are and what they can do in specific relationships. So again, crudely speaking, I see 2 dominant ways of writing about agency. So first, there's this idea of agency as an active property of an animal. You can frame an animal through their intention, their consciousness, their personhood, their culture, their world-making activities. It's kind of apprehending and interpreting agency in this way helps to improve the status of animals and their rights and their place alongside humans. And it helps make, us make more accurate interpretations of their behaviors, vis-a-vis humans. The second approach to agency is the agency that's kind of, it's an agency that you find or you locate in the passiveness of humans. And I mean like how humans need to conform to animals in our interactions with them. So the ways you find that you can find how non-human agency is revealed in the ways that they register on human activities, intentions, bodies, technologies, environments, anthropogenic environments, and so on. And this kind of notion of agency kind of looks at the vital and material role of animals in moving and transforming people's lives and the world around them. And that in order to explain what people are doing, I need to kind of look at animals, right? Like, I need to see how our actions are dependent and shaped by them. It's a reading of agency that looks at how people are exposed and open to animals. I think I'm going to talk quite an abstract level across a lot of the talk, but I think for me, it's quite a simple, intuitive notion of agency where it's like, well, if you want to approach, if you're in the wild, if you want to approach wildlife, you have to approach, for example, if you want to approach a baboon, you can't extend those same skills and techniques over to tigers, right? Like the tigers with their different capacities, different dispositions, different desires, different bodies demand a different way for us to approach them, right? That's just something, just a very simple understanding that we have to, if we think about how certain tools or technologies are made to help us interface with animals, whether it's like stirrups for a horse or an ankush for an elephant, these are tools that are shaped specifically for that animal and they're according to the demands of that animal. So I think that's the kind of agency I'm trying to get at here. And I think thinking about this second kind of agency that's, that emerges from the vulnerability of humans in relationship to animals, it also represents an important lesson from like the human animal literature in the last 20 years, which is that, even in relations and structures of domination, like even in like a pig industrial factory in Denmark, there's no such thing as absolute control or one-way domination, linear causation. Like when we interact with animals in any context, we're inevitably shaped by them, we're vulnerable to their demands. We don't exist outside of, and we don't, lord over nature. So which makes me, I guess this is the kind of things I think about when I was in the field. And with elephants, I mean, we're all aware that elephants are increasingly kind of marginalized population in 21st century landscapes, right? They're very precarious, they're vulnerable, right? But when you're working in a place and living in an area where free roaming elephants are moving back and forth between, what you cannot ignore is, like how big elephants are, right? Like they're just big animals. Like if you're living next to them, like this is, you kind of realize how corporeally, how bodily you're so vulnerable to these, mortally so vulnerable to these animals, right? And for me, this was actually one of the first and most enduring lessons that I learned, was to be cautious when I was in the presence or in the vicinity of these animals. And I think this is extended to people I work with, right? You know, I think this kind of bodily vulnerability deeply shaped how, you know, elephants were felt and understood, or, you know, kind of lived with. I mean, let's think of a very general example. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with working or living with elephants, but you know, for example, let's say you're walking through by yourself or with a couple of friends through a village at night, right? Yeah, just like, I mean, if an elephant starts coming through the village, it's happened a couple of times before, it was sometimes just best to find a way to kind of get out of the way, let the elephant walk through the kind of alleyways and do their own thing, pick at some banana tree leaves and keep moving on. Just kind of step aside and get out of the way. Or, you know, or also sometimes when we go walking in a forest and, you know, we register that there's elephants up on the hill nearby or on the path, look, it was just better to like choose a new path, right? Like go in a different direction, or maybe just wait until the elephant's gone and then move on. But yeah, like it's just, you just have to kind of conform to the elephants in the environment, right? You need to accommodate to the elephants, and you also need to be ready to have your plans kind of disrupted, right? And, you know, you have to become subject to kind of uncertain outcomes. There was one time when I rode my motorbike to a forest village, and I ended up waiting with in the village with like several other people for about 3 hours as we waited for an unusual tusker to just like move away from the vicinity of the only forest road out of there. And for some reason, it was just hanging around. No one really knew why. So yeah, I think, you know, I was kind of vulnerable to like, you know, whatever that elephant was intending on doing and why he was doing it. And I think I realized, you know, in these moments during field work is that, you know, when I'm subject to the elephant, I'm kind of forced to adopt a position that momentarily kind of concedes to that animal's perspective on and practical engagement with the environment. And in doing so, like, you know, also understand that, you know, humans not only inhabit our own little worlds that, you know, elephants can be a part of, but I also, at the same time, I also live within elephant worlds too. And so again, to go back to this, you know, the standard kind of literature and human elephant work, you know, being subject to elephants is often explored through negative and traumatic examples. But when we're kind of attuned, I think when we start getting attuned to the broader spectrum of vulnerability, it can reveal many kind of variations and small degrees of elephant agency. And it gives a sense how people's lives are shaped at different levels on a day-to-day basis. And of course, like there are heaps of other ways in which we can be moved by elephants, right? So charismatic, I think we're all very much aware of how charismatic elephants are. You know, in Assam, much like the rest of India, I think this kind of charisma emerges not only through symbolic and religious associations, but also those kind of evolutionary convergences and divergences in species, behavior and bodies. And it's an interesting thing, charisma, isn't it? It's like a kind of exposure and a kind of attraction which doesn't really dull over time. A person at Sokodor village next to Deepalbil wetland here once said to me, like, he seemed to imply there's a kind of magical power of elephants that, you know, that kind of attracted people to them, despite people see their comings and goings for like decades at a time. Yeah, I mean, you cannot really help yourself in the presence of elephants, right? You know, they have this kind of, you're susceptible to their charms, like. And, you know, and you know, it shows another aspect of agency, of this kind of like vulnerability, which is not negative, but like can sometimes be full of joy, right? And, you know, people love going and watching and standing around for hours on end. All their plans for the day change because an elephant's hanging around in the daytime, right? Of course, it becomes more complicated as well when, you know, people are chasing elephants through a village streets, but I mean, maybe that's the different story to look at. And I do actually put that in the introduction, the opening to my book, because there's a kind of story that kind of explores this tension of like the ways that elephants are pushing and pulling people all the time, and that, you know, elephants are, you know, it's in some ways how the world is animated in response to the presence of elephants. That's the Makana who was in the wetland just then. So another aspect of vulnerability that I found methodologically important was surprise. So by surprise here, I mean when an animal does something unanticipated, does something that's hard to make sense of, does something that demands a new kind of understanding. And that is that like an animal behaves in a way that escapes our explicit and implicit categorizations of who they are, what they can do, where they can live, and who they can interact with. And I think, social sciences, biological sciences, and conservation studies have struggled for periods now, or previously, and I think at certain times have struggled with the narrow limitations that they place on animals. So social scientists always regarded animals within the human-animal relationship as being merely objects. Biology too often made recourse to animals at the general species level and instinctual mechanisms. And I guess conservation studies, were quite eager to say the place of wildlife was in the forest and not outside of it. And when animals do something that's kind of beyond our expectations, it kind of reveals the limits of what we can know, the limits of our comprehension. And then also it reveals that we're always exposed to things that we can't anticipate, right? We're always exposed to being surprised. I mean, there's two ways we could deal with that, right? We could like dismiss or rationalize these surprises within our current frameworks. But I think what's interesting now in human-animal research, multi-species research, coexistence research, is that, I think researchers are becoming more open to different possibilities, right? And in some ways, they're kind of letting the animals and the people they live with, like, kind of guide their research in new directions. I mean, classic example is the way that people kind of like are turning towards indigenous worldviews in order to give a different kind of framework of the kind of like interspecies socialities and how coexistence is done and what kind of subjects elephants are, right? Personally, as a researcher, I learned about being open to surprises through the people I research, right? Like, that is people who live and work intimately with animals. And these people frequently recognize the limits of their own knowledge, what they could claim about animals, and they're quite often open to experiences of wonder. Now, I'm talking here about dog trainers, I'm talking about hunters, but I'm talking about, mahouts, but I'm also talking about people who, like farmers as well, and people who just live, nearby elephants. And I think I found, for example, that, it's usually in these kind of states of wonder and incomprehension that, people kind of realize, find themselves in the presence of the elephant as being a manifestation of Ganesh or as a kind of godlike being. And I think generally ethnographic methodology in particular encourages researchers to remain open to differences, to have one's inquiries shaped by surprises and the unexpected, and not be constrained by predetermined study questions or aims. And so, I guess all in all, I think, just being open to surprises is just a way in which, you can kind of, escape the narrow confines of prior research frameworks and just kind of develop a more multifaceted understanding of coexistence. So that's all I'll say for there about like the role of vulnerability in like conceptualizing agency and also, I guess, thinking about the possibilities of coexistence. And in part 3, I want to look a bit more how this notion of vulnerability kind of informs our concept of coexistence. So I'm going to start with conflict. So like conflict, as we know, it's a very broad word, right? And it can encompass a huge range of human-elephant interactions with negative effects, right? So whether it's like elephants and farmers battling over paddy fields or elephants being hit by trains, right? And again, I want to keep kind of breaking down these kind of concepts. I also think we need to make distinctions, right, of conflicts, right? Like, there's, for me, like I'm going to give 2 crude examples of two crude kinds of conflict here. And I think, there's the conflict that's part of coexistence, right? So there's a conflict that's part of coexistence, and there's a conflict that's against coexistence or contra coexistence. And I think the distinction can be made between these two could be made on the basis of humans' willingness to be vulnerable to elephants or not. So for instance, let's consider the first kind of conflict here, right? So, you have aggressive techniques of driving herds away from paddy fields, right? These are techniques that can often be seen as problematic and, representative of human conflict. But I mean, what's interesting for me, and I think makes me think a bit differently about these kind of like techniques, of whether it's like throwing crackers or flaming torches or spears even, all of which I've seen, is that, sometimes these techniques can be done hand in hand with forms of prayer, reverent gestures and gifts, and this belief that elephants are godlike beings, right? Now, a standard argument is to say that these are contradictory, right? But I mean, I think that they're absolutely not contradictory at all. I would say they're both modes of interaction that are, serve to mediate the degree of vulnerability to elephants in particular situations, and that they're two modes of interactions that allow them to engage with the multifaceted nature of elephants as hungry animals or godlike beings, right? And I think these mediations are part of an ongoing exchange of living together, of coexistence. And so these conflicts are just ways of negotiating tensions, risks, and dangers in sharing worlds, right? And importantly for me, they're actions that kind of stay with the trouble of elephants. And what I mean by that is that they stay with the dangers of living with elephants, but also the joys of living with elephants, right? Sure, throwing a flaming torch at an elephant might be a way of limiting a certain kind of exposure, like you don't want the elephant eating your crops, but it doesn't. But otherwise, people are happy to live, or fairly content to live with the broader vulnerabilities that they have with elephants in their day-to-day lives, right? Negative or positive. Elizabeth Oriel, who does work in Sri Lanka, and Deborah Bird Rose, an environmental humanities scholar, calls this a kind of like an ongoing process of dialogue with the more than human world, or a dialogical relationship. So let's look at the conflict kind number 2, right? So it's conflict against coexistence. I feel that in my research that I came across 2 kinds of cases of this, right? And so the first case was, and just keep in mind, the examples I'm going to give are very simplified examples for the purpose of this paper. And so like they're obviously much more complex cases, but yeah. So first is the people who lived in a kind of area not far from the main area I was working in, near Deeporbil, Sokodo, and it was like an area which had been undergoing intense kind of like crop feeding by elephants for 20 years now. There was people who were very stressed there. People get very angry, and it was a place where people began to call elephants demons, like Ohur. And it was also a place over a course of a decade, like I think about 3 elephants were killed by do-it-yourself electric fences. And the second case was the railway line that ran through Deeporbil, Sokodo. It kind of cut in half a space of movement between the hills and the wetlands, which elephants would frequently use, right? And I feel throughout the entire history of this railway line, elephants have been consistently ignored. So whether it's during the construction, people were saying, well, elephants don't actually use that space. During its operation, Indian Railways resisted slowing down for a long period of time, and that partially resulted in 15 elephants being killed over 2 decades. And then I think even now, currently Indian Railways is planning to expand and intensify its infrastructure through double lines, double tracks, and electrifying the tracks, and also just having faster and more trains. And I think that these 2 cases are against coexistence because they're actions that seek to, or will eventually exclude, alienate, ignore, and make disappear the presence of elephants from the landscape, right? So I think for farmers who electrocute or in other circumstances might poison elephants, these might be attempts to completely remove one individual from the equation, or more broadly frighten off groups of elephants from an area so they don't come back. I mean, it's the case. I think that the farmers that I interviewed, they simply were so stressed out about the thought that they just didn't want to live with any of that trouble anymore, any of that concern about elephants coming back. They didn't want to be exposed to elephants in any way, and they just didn't want to share the landscape with them anymore. And for Indian Railway, I mean, elephants just continue to be an inconvenience. And look, I mean, you know, Indian Railway, like they've made concessions, right, by slowing down, but, you know, I think elephant ways of life at Sokador Depot Bill will continue to be excluded as the railway continues to expand. And I mean, eventually it will enter a point where it won't be a viable wildlife crossing. And then what would have happened is that the train line, but the train line would have created a world where they no longer need to conform to the presence of elephants. So again, yeah, both of these forms are conflict against coexistence because they are actions that represent an unwillingness to be vulnerable to not stay with the trouble of human-elephant coexistence under certain conditions. We're going for time. Okay, I might just quickly press on through this example here, but there's one. I just want to just a bit further. Like, really, what's important here as well is that, you know, I've suggested that there's an order of conflict that's against coexistence as opposed to a conflict that's part of coexistence. But I mean, there's a big distinction here, right? And you know, that distinction is one of power, right? So I think. So a farmer who's intolerant is different from a railway line who's intolerant, right? And I think a farmer who poisons or electrocutes an elephant might do so from a deeply perceived lack of power, right? And this can emerge through their socioeconomic disenfranchisement, lack of support from the government, lack of social opportunities, and mobility, but also the fact in some cases, and this is repeated in the literature elsewhere, in some cases it's just they've lost the capacity to communicate with elephants, right? Whether that's through prayer or otherwise, right? Now, a train who's intolerant to elephant presence is not intolerant due to a lack of power, but because they have an excess of power, right? So I think railway departments are emboldened by government because they're government sanctioned and they have a self-entitled claim to this space in the name of development. I think for me, it's a kind of assumed position of domination, right? It's a monological perspective that refuses to recognize the positions of wildlife or local ways of life outside of its schedule. And so I think paying attention to vulnerability, we can consider the difference between one who can endure elephants but do not see the place of them, and those who probably do see the place of elephants but can no longer endure their presence. Okay, so finally, let's move on beyond notions of conflict and just speak about coexistence more broadly. And so I think throughout the talk, I've already been engaging with ideas of vulnerability that can help us, see how they're part of sharing worlds. Already looked at the idea of like staying with the trouble and the joys of coexistence. And while I've neglected the kind of animal dimension in this paper, focusing more on humans, I hope you understand that I'm also implying that this interspecies relationship is one of mutual vulnerability, and elephants too are shaped by people at varying degrees and scales. And also that this idea of dialogue has come up. So sharing world is an interspecies dialogue where people, whether they're willing or not, are exposed to being affected by elephant bodies and desires that are outside of their control. And that sharing lives and landscapes with wildlife, one is always exposed to being challenged and changed, like in minor and extreme ways, momentary and enduring ways, and negative and positive ways. Tom van Doren, an environmental philosopher who's engaged closely at the junctures between endangered wildlife and humans, has asked how sharing worlds might be improved by conceding to these threatened ways of life and realizing we do not get to have the world precisely as we want it. I think for Tom, he suggests that we need to acknowledge the limits of our sovereignty over the earth and over ourselves, and there are things that are never entirely ours to claim or give. So in some ways, he works against this idea of stewardship. And I think at the heart of Tom's challenge of an ethical coexistence is the question of whether we can make ourselves more vulnerable to the power of non-human agency, and sometimes at the expense of our own. Because elephants are who they are in Assam, and being materially and spiritually powerful beings, I find them very useful for thinking through the constraints on human power in interspecies relationships. Indeed, following people who live and work with elephants, I became aware of places humans cannot go or at least in certain certain contexts, how they cannot conduct themselves as they see fit. This possibility or impossibility is it's an idea that's becoming harder to imagine in the shadow of the Anthropocene, the so-called epoch where humans are figured as overwhelming the great forces of nature. However, big animals like elephants express a tremendous capacity to trouble these human-centric positions. They remind us that we live in a world where the human is not exceptional, nor outside of the non-human environment, and also that animals have claim on our landscapes and our lives too. I do think, to a degree, I think the people in my book, at least through their relationships to elephants, they didn't necessarily live with this kind of like exceptional, privileged, empowered, like anthropocentric position. But I'm going to admit, I kind of feel I'm talking about the centrality of vulnerability and coexistence and the value of it. I really do feel like a privileged white guy preaching from afar, right? And it's kind of ironic that I'm writing about these corporeal frailties that in my life have been materially and symbolically pushed to the margins when I live in like a kind of urban environment in Europe, right? And I think, writing about the lack of control and unpower that defines human-elephant worlds and possibly coexistence more broadly, it's an idea that is difficult to articulate without either normalizing or problematizing this kind of condition of existence. Like I'm in no way in the best position to make any claim, but I think that I do feel that from my research that being subject to the troubling agency of large animals like elephants is an unavoidable part of sharing lives and landscapes, right? It's an existence where these kinds of accompanying uncertainties, these risks, they just can't be evaded or overcome, right? But of course, there's an issue here because, the vulnerability experienced by humans and elephants in the 21st century are not simply a natural dynamic, right? These relations can't be disentangled from the political, historical, and ecological injustices which throw these two species together in such intense and volatile interactions. And they're injustices that exacerbate any corporeal risks there are of sharing worlds. So talking about vulnerability in the broader sense, which I have been through most of this paper, in fact threatens to overlook these injustices. So I'm kind of looping back with a critique, I guess, of what I was trying to do. And I'm going to admit, I am an academic that has been swayed by proposals to become more vulnerable to non-humans in order to better challenge human, non-human hierarchies, animal-human hierarchies, and also improve multi-species flourishing, right? And I think, it's not exactly, I don't think it's exactly wrong. And I do think this appeal to vulnerability is a central tenet of like multi-species research. I've already mentioned Van Duren. There's a host of other scholars I could include. Juna Salazar-Pereñas, for example, she did work on orangutan rehabilitation center in Borneo, and she talks about that corporeal exposure to other than human life as a strategy for tackling the problem of extinction, where extinction is a problem that was founded on histories of domination and the pretension of control under British colonialism or European colonialism. But I think, I think there's good reason to explore this broader notion of vulnerability, but I think, and its role in coexistence and how it can help us better understand coexistence, but it always needs to be accompanied by an extra question, right? And that question is, who needs to become more vulnerable when it comes to wildlife, right? I don't have a positive, I don't have a positive answer for that. And the only answer about I don't have a positive answer about who needs to become more vulnerable. The only answer I do have is that, we cannot look to people who are already living with vulnerability alongside these animals. Yet it's often these people, who are most affected by elephants, who are also those who are expected to make more changes to improve coexistence. And this international funding, research, conservation actors, they play a significant role in programs that seek to change the perspectives and attitudes of local people, shift their livelihoods, discipline their movements, and in some cases, relocate communities entirely. And this is a long-standing critique in anthropology, and it's a strong and emerging critique and like notion of decolonization, and I think, and I'm not saying that like these programs are ineffective, because they can be effective sometimes, you know, to improve the worlds of elephants. It's just that what is overlooked in these programs is that such interventions ask already highly vulnerable people to further relinquish power over themselves in relationship to wildlife. And it's an oversight that reflects a failure to respect how these people are already taking initiatives and supporting coexistence every day. Human and elephant communities are already living with risks and making concessions all the time. They're adapting to unexpected circumstances, they're being surprised and changed, and they're always finding new ways to share the practical burden of being together in the 21st century. I mean, I think what we need to be working towards is finding ways to scaffold the vulnerabilities of local human and elephant communities, like wherever they are in whatever landscape. So I don't have much more to add at that point. I hope it wasn't too abstract and my Australian accent wasn't too incomprehensible. It's funny because I did start out distinguishing two concepts of vulnerability, but then I ended up on a critique saying that we can't explore this kind of like ontological condition of vulnerability without also attending to the contextual and political nuances of it, which is absolutely fine, right? That's fine. But I think, I guess the takeaway point that I want to say is that if we maintain an awareness of this broader experience of vulnerability, it might allow us to account for all the different ways, not only negative and not only spectacular ways, in which species affect the other. We can, you know, map out how they're becoming susceptible to each other and exposed to each other in new ways and in new conditions, like how vulnerabilities are changing, mutual vulnerabilities are changing. And it also, attending to this broader vulnerability also allows us to analyse how local human and elephant communities find or do not find ways to navigate and communicate within these new risky and shared arrangements. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the talk, Paul. That was very interesting. Give us a lot to think about. And I would like to open up the floor to anyone who might have any questions or comments about the talk. Oh, I believe Tarsh has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That was great. Quick question. I'll maybe get to start off with to get the ball rolling. I really liked your idea of the two kinds of conflict, right? Conflict that allows or people to continue to share space, and conflict that kind of cuts off that sharing entirely. But on a more kind of simplistic way of understanding vulnerability, that was also really nice to kind of understand vulnerability from the perspective of the local communities who live there, versus vulnerability of elephants maybe at, say, national or global scales. So I often think of it in terms of scale, that it isn't the people there who are sharing space with animals who need to kind of further be disempowered in any way or further face the brunt of elephants in any way. But at the same time, at a national or global scale, it is true that elephants and most other species are kind of taking a battering. And when you think about humans in general, elephants are kind of receiving end or getting the short end of the stick. So there is a kind of problem there. So when I kind of what comes to mind for me very pragmatically is this idea of CBDR or polluter pays, which is in the climate space, right? A common but differentiated responsibility. So it isn't those people who are necessarily causing the extinction of elephants or the shrinking of habitats. It is humanity as a whole. And how do you come around it? You go down this climate way of polluter pays. That seems to be the only solution. But that again seems to me to reduce this deep kind of cultural attachment to elephants to something very transactional. I don't know if my question is making sense, but it is finally how do you overcome this problem that local communities who are facing the brunt of damage with elephants are finally the ones that have to continue to tolerate elephants if we kind of as humanity don't want elephants to go extinct. What is the solution to that kind of intersectionality of vulnerabilities almost, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I certainly have no idea. It's a tough question, isn't it? I think that's the question. I think there's two issues, right? I think first, yeah, as opposed to like making, yeah, local people on the ground further pay for these issues, like we have to find ways. I think this kind of framework of vulnerability can help us think of how to scaffold and reduce vulnerabilities at their multiple scales, right? And see what's important, what vulnerabilities are important to tackle and what vulnerabilities are, able to let go and continue. I mean, I think that's one step, right? And I think, but the second step of like, I think there's a big question is like, yeah, like I mean, how do you assess who needs to become more vulnerable, right? And again, that ends up requiring like, understanding the broader connections of and impacts of people on, the environments that, local human and elephant communities live in, right? I mean, I think we've had discussions before, Tash, that sometimes we have to start considering the kind of like, the colonial and, transnational kind of elements in capitalism and how they kind of affect these kind of local worlds. Yeah, but I mean, if it was me, I would say you just have to start targeting like government infrastructure and capital industry, right? And they're the places that need to kind of scale back all the time, right? And think about what they're doing. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I think I think those kind of an answer about like has become more vulnerable, how to solve that problem, and where to look. I mean, that's kind of yeah. I don't think I'm prepared to answer such a question with any authority, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think Aditya also has his hand up.
Uh, Hi, Paul. Excellent talk. Thanks. It was really nice to understand the way you distinguish between types of conflicts and also vulnerabilities. So, a couple of things. I really liked how you put in a slide about you being a white male from global. Something like, I mean, I'm working on elephants, but that's some educated people coming in and looking for I mean, I'm an ecologist and finding ways where how people and animals can coexist. And you raise this very important question. So, when we are talking about coexistence, it is the people who are living in these areas which are bordering national parks, protected areas, where they are coming into contact with elephants or other large wildlife. Do you believe, and here I again to go back to that idea that like as an urban educated person, like I, I don't know what is our space to tell people how to live their lives, right? That's one ethical conundrum that I always find. The other is, I wanted your opinion. Do you think in order to extend the vulnerabilities of a society and not just those communities that are living in these areas, that we could think of a social security net for people that live with wildlife conflict? Because I mean, I've just been pondering over it, and I would love to know your thoughts on it.
Yeah, that social security net's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I think I mean, while I was doing field work in Assam, like the kind of compensation things like this, like government led, was usually quite ineffective. I mean, and that did kind of add to that stress, right? I mean, though I have heard other stories where, yeah, having kind of social security and also compensation kind of approaches can add that extra buffer, right? I think, and particularly for like huge economic losses in relation to crops. So I think, yeah, so that's one way of like identifying a certain vulnerability and where stresses are coming from, and yeah, and targeting it, right? And yeah, I think, yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I think, how effective it will be over a long term, and whether it, targets all the sufficient, whether it deals with all the other issues of vulnerability or negative vulnerabilities, I can't really say for sure. Yeah, space to help engage people on how to live their lives. I mean, I'm an anthropologist, right? So I'm more the kind of person where I'm like, well, you tell me, people on the ground, what you think is working best for you, right? And so, I mean, I'm quite conscious that maybe, it's about amplifying certain ideas that work in certain places, right? And seeing if they can be extended to other landscapes as well. I mean, or certain ideas that are being done by a certain part of the community and seeing if that can be extended out. I mean, yeah, I'm certainly, I think for me, it's I think this any kind of concept of like, coexistence as being brought from outside is really problematic, and I think this is why I think there needs to be lots of kind of good ethnographic research on the ground just to see how coexistence is actually done, in all its multiple forms, right? So, and then finding ways of amplifying those solutions and voices, both within that landscape, but potentially to other landscapes, right? Like I'm aware that, sometimes local solutions don't extend generally, and that's fine, but I think they can sometimes too, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I always wonder a bit as well, like, and how do you, like, because I think, especially coming in Assam, where I think, this notion of elephants being kind of godlike and there's other kind of modes of communication with elephants as well. It's like, how do you, I mean, how do you kind of like amplify or scaffold or support these modes of communication and connections with elephants, right? But I mean, yeah, I guess there's a whole range of kind of issues we could look at, but yeah, I don't know, just amplifying local voices, I guess that's my thing.
Just one point, even about like what you're saying about Assam, where the elephants are revered. That's true for, I mean, most places in our country, right? And yet, I mean, I work with MCF. We work in Karnataka. I mean, I wouldn't say the idea is still the same. But I mean, the scales of conflict in terms of damage and all are very different. But at the same time, the kind of power asymmetries also you talked about in terms of the vulnerabilities that are faced in farmers that plant different crops, like a paddy farmer versus a big plantation owner. And the voices, like a paddy farmer does not get the compensation back as often as a coffee planter who has like internet, has people, knows people in the forest department. And so those kind of power dynamics also, like within human power dynamics itself, kind of complicates the landscape.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I've got no doubt it actually works like that. Hey, yeah, like I think that's right. Like I mean, so you'd have to. So I guess what you're suggesting is like a social security net. You need something that kind of can partially bypass these networks of power by which compensation could be achieved or received. I guess. Yeah, that's kind of very interesting. Yeah. Huh.
Thanks, Paul.
No, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question if anyone has any.
I could do a follow-up, Paul, even on this whole question of railways, right? The challenge is, again, if you think of justice, development, all of that on global scales, the argument is that India needs to develop. There isn't the room to almost say that we won't have railways, because the alternative then is cars almost, and roads, which are even worse in terms of the impact when you put new roads and thousands of cars move through landscapes. So yeah, again, a question of whose priority is it to save the Asian elephant? Is it a kind of shared global priority, or is it one that is left to India? Yeah, not an easy question again.
Right. Yeah. Right. That's No, that's right. So yeah, let's focus on the railways, right? That's a good one because I mean that's something that it's such a it's wow. I mean yeah, that's right. It's like Indian Railways is a big Indian institution, right? And I think that there's lots of problems with Indian Railways. I think in their relationship to elephants, but I mean yeah, we also have to be conscious of the fact that these forms of infrastructure are things that are, they're direct outputs of colonialism, right? And a certain kinds of way of imagining extraction and a relationship to place, right? And yeah, I think there needs to be some kind of understanding of that too. But I mean, yeah, I think so. I mean, what would happen there then, though? Like, so I mean, obviously, obviously you can't get rid of railways, right? That's not going to happen anywhere, and you can't. But you can ask for railways to slow down, like how much that affects, like schedules and profit is another thing. But I mean, I guess the question is like, could you end up like finding a way to buffer those, like buffer the losses, right, from these things, right, by asking, uh, Indian development. It's not really Indian development, isn't it? It's like, it's actually like, that's the thing. Like, development's a weird word. I think we get caught up with this notion of development. It's a bad word because I mean, railways is actually supporting a range of different kind of capital enterprises and international businesses and like, and extractions and stuff. So, yeah, but yeah, I mean, how could you end up like saying that like, yeah, like Europe requires needs to kind of like, you know, make up for like the kind of any kind of added vulnerabilities, India needs to take on to improve coexistence. I mean, yeah, I mean, what is that? Is that like something that needs to be done at a political level, like a national level, like asking for repatriations or compensations? And is it a monetary thing? I mean, is that the only way that, like, like bodies, actors, peoples, and governments beyond India are able to like engage in this issue problem? I mean, I'm not really too sure. It's a tough one. I certainly don't think that India, even at levels like that, Indian Railways, like a government institution like that, like India should be taking no, they shouldn't be taking all the weight of coexistence. Absolutely not. I mean,
Thanks.
So Vinay had a question that he wrote on the chat. I'll just read it out to you. He says, "Hello, Dr. Paul. Thank you for such a wonderful talk. What do you think about different sections of human social groups not being vulnerable to each other, and how is it contributing to human and non-human conflict or coexistence?"
yeah,
I think Sahil and Anandi also had their hands up. Do you want to maybe take questions together and see take group in some way, or do one at a time? Up to you, Paul.
Yeah, maybe I guess because we've got limited time as well, right? I think let's maybe just take it as a group, and then I can try and let's do that.
I just wanted to respond to the conversation that Tarshu and Paul were having. I didn't really have a question as such, but I can go later. Anandi, I think her hand went up before mine.
Yeah, hi, Paul. Thanks so much for your talk. I was curious. I think I mentioned this to you before. I'm really curious about uncertainty, and I just wanted to ask you, like, what is the relationship between uncertainty and vulnerability in this situation? And I recently asked a farmer that I work with. I said, things have become more uncertain. I think that's something you write about, like in your book as well. And she said, but that's just part of life. Uncertainty is a normal part of life. And I think this is something like maybe a common way of thinking. A lot of people share in the East. So this idea that things are always a little uncertain. So then how does that sort of interact with feeling vulnerable for the people?
Yeah, that's great. I might answer Anandi's question first, then I'll move on to Vinay's, if that's okay. Yeah, no, so firstly, yeah, I mean, I think just quickly, uncertainty's got everything to do with vulnerability. Like, absolutely, I think at the heart of vulnerability actually is uncertainty, right? I think it's this unknowability. And so I think that's a key part. That's actually a key part that got me thinking about this stuff. It's very interesting that you say this idea about, I think for me, I'd be very interested to hear more about how uncertainty figures into worldviews beyond the Western worldview, because obviously the frameworks I'm working from and the scholars I'm working with, they're people who are coming from a particularly Western tradition of thinking about that. And so I think, yeah, exploring how uncertainty has a place in that world and how it's, informed by different ontologies. I mean, that'd be a really great contribution, I think. But yeah, I think, but then there's also this other critical, I think, but then as a critical scholar, I guess the question becomes is like, at what point do we start, where is those thresholds where like this kind of like, we start critiquing how like, certain societal structures are, making uncertainty too overly prominent or too prominent, and is that being recognized or picked up by local people, or is it just being incorporated as part of this worldview? And so, yeah, I think that'd be a really kind of interesting thing to learn about as well. I mean, Yeah, I think there's two parts here. Like, as an anthropologist, ethnographer, like talking about the ontology of people and how uncertainty figures, but also taking that critical approach and seeing how that intersects. So, yeah. And Vinay, absolutely. But I think that's absolutely a key part. So I think I'm going to just go back to trains because I'm thinking about trains a lot lately. Sri Lanka actually had 6 elephants killed today or yesterday. But anyway, yeah, I think it's precisely their part. They're exact. I think the train line that's actually fails to respond or is resisting being vulnerable to elephants is also equally also doing the same thing to local people who live in the area, right? Like when they built the train line, it kind of cut through villages that didn't really care about the byways of life, how people use the landscape, and it was, in many ways, it kind of, ignores prior worlds or ongoing worlds, right, which it passes. So they're absolutely both kind of deeply kind of interconnected issues, right? I think, yeah, absolutely can't ignore in analysis. But yeah, on other levels as well. I can't say, like, I think it's, Assam's got its own particular cosmology and way of doing stuff, but I think certainly, like, with the kind of, like, indigenous communities in Assam and their own struggles for recognition, these certainly play a big role as well, and like whether actually people are, appropriately responding to their needs for assistance or additional mobilities, and these things can have like a big kind of part in, like, their kind of stuckness on the fringes and being exposure to elephants.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks.
Sahil, do you want to speak and then we can wrap it up?
Yeah, I just wanted to, thanks, Paul. I really deeply enjoyed your talk, and the lens of vulnerability is I think a very productive lens to look through. And I just wanted to add to the question that Darsh asked, and the idea of justice. And I think it's justice, again, is a very subjective concept. And what are the boundaries of justice? If we look at the Western jurisprudence, the boundaries are humans primarily, and a tiny section on animal rights, mostly to do with pets. But if you look at a much wider idea of justice, does that include non-human justice, justice to non-humans? If that is included, then all layers of justice you're accountable to deliver justice to all different kinds of exigencies, and particularly in a place like India that is increasingly, endorsing, the Make in India or an Indian culture-centered approach to growth and development. If you look at that, then our idea of justice has always included the non-human, and so the template is there. It's just that that's not our jurisprudence is Western. It's not Indian. So the kind of contradiction in the idea of justice itself. The other thing that I wanted to say about development and railways and tying in what Ravi has offered in the chat, I think, in the Anthropocene, sometimes the question is not whether you should do a project or not. That is often the question, but that, I guess, no longer is the relevant question. If you look at the justice about everyone has the right to basic development, then the question is how you do it, and what should be the boundaries of such construction. So that, to me, is a more productive discussion. What you end up is then this, species agnostic or non-human agnostic development. The rail line has to go where it wants to go, where someone wants to send it through, and not, can we take it from here to there, and can we put things under it or over it, so that other forms of life can always also live. That is more, I think, a productive conversation in today, because otherwise the rest of the world wouldn't engage with a conversation on whether.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think it's like staying with the trouble is like not like stripping out to some new ideal of world, right? It's about like continuously making modifications that can continuously improve what's possible, right? But yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, unfortunately with Indian Railways, they're also quite resistant to like, injecting a lot of money in order to make these huge scale, like it's a lot of money as well. Like it's this kind of weird kind of system that it's like, just so almost unstoppable by the pure weight of its kind of like, materiality, but also like it's, the funding it requires to run, but also the funding it receives. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I've got no response to like this notion of justice at the inter level. I mean, for me, it's absolutely fascinating. It's such a great point. I mean, what am I going to say? It's like, really good. But yeah, no, but I think that what I can say is absolutely right. Like, it's not about like these things. It's not about like thinking about ideal opportunities. It's just continuously tinkering, finding new ways, and that's absolutely the most interesting conversation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you everyone for your questions. Thanks for the amazing talk. Let's wrap this up. We have already gotten way past time, but that's natural considering how interesting both the talk and the discussion was. So yeah, thank you everyone for attending the talk. Thank you, Paul, again. Stay tuned to our socials to just keep updated on the information on our future talks. And if you yourself would like to give this talk, or if you know someone who would be, if you would like to nominate someone, then please reach out to us and we can make it happen. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, guys. Yeah, thanks very much for listening in. And anyone who put messages in the chat, I'll try and get back to you. Yeah, thanks for your questions.
Okay.
Thank
See you all.
you.
Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.